The day my mother asked me to stop pretending came disguised as a day when nothing was supposed to happen. My name is Dex, or at least that's the name everyone used, the one that fit neatly into school rosters, job applications, and the expectations people handed me without asking whether it felt right in my mouth. I had never hated it. That's important. I didn't grow up in pain or rebellion. I grew up in something quieter and harder to explain, a persistent sense of being slightly misaligned, like furniture pushed an inch too close to the wall so you keep brushing against it without ever seeing the problem directly. I was 17 that year, living in the same narrow house I'd grown up in, the one that smelled faintly of detergent and old books no matter how often we cleaned. It was just my mother and me. My father had left when I was young enough that his absence felt more like architecture than loss, something the house had been built around. My mother's name was Martha, spelled with 2 A's, which she once told me was because her own mother believed symmetry was dishonest. Martha believed things should show their imbalance. She was not dramatic, not sentimental, but deeply intentional. She noticed everything and commented on very little. When she did speak, it was usually after she had already lived with the thought long enough to know it wasn't going to leave her. She worked as a school administrator, a job that suited her temperament, quiet authority, careful listening, the ability to make decisions that affected people without ever making herself the center of them. At home, she was the same. Our conversations were rarely long, but they were dense. When she asked a question, it stayed asked. That morning, nothing marked itself as important. I was getting ready for school. She was already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea untouched, watching the steam disappear. When I passed her on the way upstairs, she looked at me with the kind of attention that made me slow down without knowing why. "After you're ready," she said, "come to the bathroom." She didn't explain. She never explained things prematurely. Explanation, to her, was something you earned by staying present. The upstairs bathroom was small and imperfect in ways I knew intimately, the mirror warped slightly on the left side, the floor tile always cold no matter the season, the faint crack above the sink that looked like a hairline fracture if you didn't stare too long. Martha stood near the door, holding a small white box. She said my name first. Not sharply. Not gently. Just accurately. "Dex." I answered without thinking. That reflex alone should have told me something. She placed the box in my hands. Velinex, printed plainly, no color beyond black and white. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of its contents, but because of the care with which she'd chosen when to give it to me. "This is part of a tradition in our family," she said. I remember waiting for more. A story. A justification. Something to make the word tradition feel less like a shield and more like a bridge. But she didn't offer it. Instead, she reached past me and set a folded dress on the edge of the sink. It was simple. Blue. Soft cotton. The kind of dress that belonged to a person who lived inside their own body comfortably, who didn't need clothing to argue on their behalf. That detail mattered. It told me this wasn't about disguise or performance. It was about honesty. I felt heat rise in my face, not shame exactly, but recognition. The kind that arrives before language can catch up. "You're not required to understand this immediately," Martha said. "But you are responsible for how you respond to it." That was how she taught me most things. Not through rules, but through accountability. I wanted to ask her how long she had known. I wanted to ask whether this was about me, or about her, or about something unresolved that predated us both. I wanted to ask what Velinex did, and what it meant, and whether taking it would make something irreversible. Mostly, I wanted to ask whether she was afraid. But fear, in our house, was something you learned to handle privately. She left the room after that. No instructions. No ultimatum. Just space. I sat on the edge of the tub and stared at my reflection. I didn't see a revelation. I saw a person who had learned early how to be agreeable, how to pass unnoticed, how to meet expectations without ever fully inhabiting them. I thought about the way people spoke about gender like it was a destination rather than a conversation. I thought about how often I had let silence make my decisions for me, I thought about the moral weight of choice, not just choosing for yourself, but choosing honestly so that others weren't forced to relate to a version of you that wasn't real. I didn't put the dress on right away. Instead, I unfolded it slowly, as if the act itself required consent. The fabric was cool, ordinary, and deeply human. Nothing about it promised transformation. What it offered was permission to stop pretending I already knew who I was. In that moment, I understood something that would take me years to fully articulate. This wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about allowing myself to be seen by myself, without negotiation. The consequences of that choice, social, emotional, ethical, had not yet arrived. But they were already waiting. And for the first time, I didn't look away. The first consequence wasn't public. It wasn't dramatic. It arrived quietly, the way responsibility usually does, through repetition. Once you notice yourself, you don't get to go back to being accidental. In the days that followed, I became acutely aware of how often I had relied on habit to avoid decision. What I wore. How I spoke. The way I occupied space. None of it had ever felt false, exactly, but it also hadn't felt chosen. Now every small action carried a question beneath it: is this me, or is this momentum? I didn't take the Velinex right away. That mattered to me. I needed to know that whatever unfolded wouldn't be driven by urgency or fear. Martha hadn't framed it as a solution, she'd framed it as an option. An invitation to pay attention over time. At school, nothing had changed, and everything had. I noticed how boys were allowed to be careless with emotion as long as they stayed careless in the right direction. I noticed how girls were permitted complexity but punished for certainty. I noticed how often people used humor to police each other back into place. None of this was new information. What was new was my inability to ignore it. My closest friend, Jonah, sat next to me in history class. We'd known each other since middle school, long enough that silence between us didn't require explanation. One afternoon, while we were working on a group assignment, he glanced at me and frowned. "You okay?" he asked. Not casually. Accurately. I considered lying. Not because the truth was forbidden, but because it was unfinished. "I'm thinking," I said. He nodded, accepting that answer the way people do when they trust you not to misuse their patience. That trust weighed on me more than judgment would have. At home, Martha adjusted without announcing it. She knocked before entering my room now, not because she hadn't before, but because the knock carried intention. She left space for conversation without demanding it. She cooked meals that took longer, as if slowing time could make room for thought. One evening, I asked her what she meant by tradition. She didn't answer immediately. "In our family," she said eventually, "people have a habit of surviving by disappearing. Not physically. Internally. They learn early how to fit, how not to trouble anyone, how to become reliable shapes." I waited. "The tradition," she continued, "is interrupting that pattern before it calcifies." That was the first time she acknowledged that this wasn't just about me. I asked her whether she was afraid for me. "Yes," she said. "But fear doesn't absolve me of responsibility." That sentence changed how I understood love. A week later, I took the Velinex for the first time. Not ceremonially. Not defiantly. Just deliberately. Nothing immediate happened. No rush. No clarity. What I felt instead was attentiveness, like tuning an instrument and realizing how out of tune it had been only after it stopped sounding wrong. The changes, when they came, were subtle and uneven. Emotional before physical. A loosening. A willingness to feel uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. I found myself less interested in proving anything, more interested in understanding why proof had ever felt necessary. I started journaling, not about identity, but about reaction. What made me defensive? What made me quiet? What made me feel unexpectedly present? Patterns emerged that had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with honesty. The dress appeared more often in my room. Still private. Still quiet. It didn't feel like an escape. It felt like alignment, a way of letting my body participate in conversations my mind had been having for years. The real tension arrived the first time someone almost noticed. It was my aunt, visiting unexpectedly one Saturday afternoon. I'd forgotten the dress was hanging behind my door. She didn't comment directly, she never would, but her eyes lingered just long enough to communicate confusion. Later, she asked Martha if everything was okay. Martha answered, yes. Not defensively. Not dismissively. Just truthfully. I realized then that honesty wasn't just something I owed myself. It was something others would have to decide how to respond to. I couldn't manage their reactions without becoming invisible again. That night, lying awake, I understood the real risk wasn't rejection. It was being known, and choosing not to retreat. Not the dramatic kind people imagine when they think of change, the shouting, the ultimatums, the clean lines between before and after, but the slower resistance that shows up when a life you've been living without thinking begins to ask for intention. Friction lives in pauses, in half-finished sentences, in the way people look at you a second longer than before and then look away as if they've seen something private by accident. By then, the Velinex had become part of my routine, not a ritual, not a symbol, just something I took in the morning with water while the house was still quiet. I paid attention the way the insert advised, not searching for confirmation, not chasing a destination, just observing. What surprised me most wasn't how I felt when something shifted, but how much effort I'd been spending before to keep certain feelings muted. Letting go of that effort freed up space I didn't know I'd been missing. I laughed more easily. Not louder, just more honestly. I noticed when sadness arrived instead of pushing it aside as inefficient. My emotions stopped lining up neatly with expectation, and for the first time, that felt like integrity rather than failure. School became harder in a very specific way. Nothing about my grades changed. Teachers still described me as reliable. But reliability began to feel like a question instead of a compliment. Reliable for whom? Reliable at what cost? I started to realize how often I'd been rewarded for making myself easy to interpret. When I stopped doing that, when I hesitated before answering, when I chose silence because I was thinking rather than because I was afraid, people grew subtly uneasy. It wasn't hostility. It was recalibration. Jonah noticed before anyone else. We were walking home one afternoon, the long way, because neither of us wanted to go back to houses that expected us to be finished versions of ourselves. He kicked a stone down the sidewalk, watched it skid into a storm drain, then said, "You're different lately." I waited. "Not bad," he added quickly. "Just, present." That word landed with surprising force. "I'm trying to be," I said. He nodded, accepting that too. But after a moment, he asked, "Are you okay with that?" I thought about it before answering. That felt new too, answering only after checking. "Yes," I said. And meant it. The first time I left the house wearing something that wasn't strictly what people expected of me, my hands shook, not visibly, but internally, like a low-grade tremor. It wasn't the clothes themselves, they were still modest, still ordinary. It was the decision to let the outside reflect even a fraction of what was happening inside. Martha noticed immediately. She didn't comment on what I was wearing. She commented on how I stood. "You're taking up space differently," she said. I asked her whether that worried her. "Yes," she answered. "And I'm proud of you anyway." That sentence held two truths without resolving them, which felt like a gift. The world's response, when it came, was uneven. Some people didn't notice at all. Others noticed and chose politeness over curiosity. A few noticed and let confusion harden into something sharper. None of it was catastrophic. That was almost worse. There was no single moment I could point to and say, "This is where it became difficult." Difficulty arrived as accumulation. A whisper here. A look there. A teacher asking if everything was stable at home. A classmate joking a little too loudly. Each moment small enough to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern that asked something of me. How visible are you willing to be? I made mistakes. I snapped once at a girl who asked a clumsy but sincere question. I avoided a conversation with Jonah that I knew I owed him because I was afraid of burdening him with uncertainty. I stayed quiet in a group discussion when I could have spoken up, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Those moments mattered. They reminded me that growth didn't exempt me from responsibility. If I wanted others to meet me with empathy, I had to practice it even when I was tired. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat on my bed and stared at the dress hanging on the back of my door. I felt overwhelmed, not by identity, but by expectation. By the pressure to explain myself well, to represent something larger than my own life, to be careful not to confuse people too much. I realized then how unfair that pressure was, and how often marginalized people carry it without being asked. The realization didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. I talked to Martha that night. Really talked. About fear. About resentment. About the temptation to disappear again just to rest. She listened without interruption. "You're allowed to be unfinished," she said when I was done. "But you're not allowed to be dishonest to buy comfort. That kind of comfort always sends the bill later." I understood then that this wasn't just a story about gender or expression. It was a story about integrity, about aligning action with awareness even when that alignment costs something. By the end of that stretch of weeks, I hadn't arrived anywhere. I wasn't resolved. But I was no longer accidental. And that, I was beginning to learn, was a form of courage most people never practiced. I didn't understand at the time that there is a difference between deciding who you are and allowing yourself to be witnessed. I had mistaken the first for the hard part. The second was where the real work waited. Up until then, most of my choices had lived inside spaces I could control. My room. The house. The quiet understanding between my mother and me, where nothing had to be explained out loud to be real. Even school, with all its eyes and routines, still allowed a kind of anonymity. I could move slightly out of alignment and people would chalk it up to mood, adolescence, distraction. No one demanded coherence yet. But coherence has a way of asking for daylight. The invitation from Jonah came on a Saturday morning, casual and unweighted, which is how most turning points announce themselves if they're not trying to scare you away. A few people, a cafe, no plan beyond being together for a few hours. I read the message and felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not dread, exactly, but calculation. How visible would I be? How much energy would this cost? How much of myself would I need to compress to make the room comfortable? That internal math had guided me for years. I was good at it. Too good. Standing in my room later, deciding what to wear, I noticed how automatic my hands were when they reached for the safest option. Neutral colors. Familiar shapes. Clothes that asked nothing of the person looking at them. For a moment, I let myself imagine choosing them and felt the immediate relief that followed. Ease is persuasive. It promises rest. But then another thought arrived, quieter but steadier than relief. If you keep choosing what costs you nothing, you'll eventually stop noticing what it costs you. That thought didn't accuse me. It didn't demand bravery. It simply refused to be ignored. I didn't choose something dramatic. That wasn't the point. I chose something that felt aligned, something that reflected the way I'd been inhabiting my body lately, the way my attention had shifted inward and outward at the same time. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't ask whether I looked convincing. I asked whether I looked like someone who was telling the truth. When I passed through the kitchen, my mother looked up from what she was doing and paused. She didn't comment on specifics. She never did when something mattered. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," she said. "But you do owe them consistency. Let your actions speak at their own pace." Outside, the neighborhood moved the way it always had. Leaves scraped along the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Someone laughed too loudly, the sound carrying without context. The ordinariness of it all grounded me. Whatever I was carrying into the day, the world wasn't stopping to evaluate it. That realization loosened something in my chest. The cafe was warm and crowded, windows fogged with conversation and breath. When Jonah saw me, he stood and waved, then hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. Not shock. Adjustment. He stepped forward and hugged me the same way he always had, firm and familiar. "You good?" he asked, quietly. "Yes," I said, and felt how much work it had taken to make that answer honest. Not everyone recalibrated as smoothly. A few people stared a beat too long, curiosity and uncertainty tangling in their expressions. Someone made a joke that wasn't cruel but wasn't careful either, then apologized so quickly it felt like they were trying to erase the moment instead of understand it. Another person avoided looking at me altogether, which carried its own kind of weight. Being ignored deliberately is a strange form of attention. What unsettled me most wasn't the discomfort. It was how instinctively I wanted to manage it. To reassure. To explain. To smooth the edges so no one else had to feel unsettled by my presence. I realized then how deeply I had been trained to prioritize other people's ease over my own coherence. Letting go of that impulse felt almost rude, like breaking an unspoken rule. But the longer I sat with it, the more I understood that constantly managing others' reactions wasn't kindness, it was control disguised as courtesy. Midway through the afternoon, someone I barely knew asked, carefully, if I wanted to talk about what was going on. Her tone wasn't invasive. It was tentative, as if she were asking permission to be curious without being harmful. I considered giving a neat explanation. I considered deflecting with humor. Instead, I said, "I'm still figuring it out." Her shoulders relaxed. "That makes sense," she said, and meant it. That exchange stayed with me because it revealed something I hadn't expected: uncertainty can be more relatable than certainty. Not everyone needs you to arrive fully formed. Some people just need you to be honest about where you are. Walking home later, alone, the day caught up with me. I felt tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, not exhausted, but spent. Visibility required energy. It asked for presence, for restraint, for the discipline not to disappear when things got uncomfortable. Courage, I was learning, wasn't a single act. It was maintenance. At home, my mother looked at me and knew without asking that something significant had happened. She always seemed to know when I'd been carrying more than usual. "How did it feel?" she asked. I searched for the right word. "Textured," I said finally. She smiled. "Reality usually is." That night, lying in bed, I thought about how many people never allow themselves to feel that texture. How many lives are spent sanding down the edges of selfhood until nothing catches, nothing resists, nothing demands attention. I understood why that path was tempting. I still do. But I also knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that I couldn't go back to being accidental. I had seen myself move through the world with intention and survive the consequences. I had learned that discomfort didn't equal danger, and that misunderstanding didn't automatically require retreat. Most importantly, I had learned that identity isn't proven by declarations or moments of courage. It's practiced through repetition, through choosing, again and again, to show up honestly even when it would be easier not to. Nothing resolved that day. No conclusions were reached. No labels settled into place. But something endured. And endurance, I was beginning to understand, was its own quiet form of integrity. The next shift didn't come from being seen. It came from being answered. Up until then, most of what I had encountered from the world was reaction, looks, pauses, recalibrations, the subtle labor people did to fit me into whatever framework felt safest to them. Even discomfort had been impersonal, more about disruption than disagreement. Part of me had assumed that was how it would stay: quiet tension, low-grade curiosity, nothing that demanded a response from either side. I underestimated how much honesty invites dialogue. It began at school, not in a hallway or classroom, but in the counselor's office, a place already weighted with the assumption that something had gone wrong. I was called in one afternoon with no explanation. That alone set my nerves humming. When you've spent your life avoiding trouble, being summoned feels like accusation even before anyone speaks. The counselor, Ms. Alvarez, gestured for me to sit. She didn't smile professionally, she smiled personally, which made it harder to guess where the conversation was headed. I want to be clear, she said, before I could say anything. You're not in trouble. I nodded, waiting. A few teachers have noticed changes, she continued. Not problems. Changes. And because we're responsible for student well-being, I wanted to check in. There it was, the institutional version of concern. Careful, well-intentioned, and heavy with implication. I realized in that moment that I had crossed an invisible line. My internal process had become legible enough that systems designed to notice deviation had begun to notice me. That wasn't a failure of discretion. It was a consequence of visibility. I'm okay, I said, truthfully. Then, after a pause, I'm thinking more carefully about how I live. Ms. Alvarez studied me, not searching for risk, but for coherence. Do you feel supported at home? She asked. Yes. Do you feel pressured to be something you're not? I thought about that longer than she probably expected. Less than I used to, I said. She nodded slowly. That's good. Just remember, you don't owe the school clarity. You owe yourself safety. I left that office with a strange mix of gratitude and resentment. Gratitude that I hadn't been treated as a problem. Resentment that my existence had been quietly logged as a variable worth monitoring. That tension followed me for days. Around the same time, Jonah finally asked the question we'd both been circling. We were sitting on the steps behind the gym after school, watching the sky dim toward evening. He didn't preface it. Didn't soften it with jokes. Are you changing your name? He asked. The question landed harder than I expected, not because it was invasive, but because it touched something unfinished. Names carry weight. They're how other people hold you when you're not in the room. I don't know, I said. He nodded. Okay. That was it. No pressure. No disappointment. Just space. Later, alone, I said my name out loud, Dex, and listened to how it felt in my mouth. Familiar. Functional. Slightly distant. I didn't reject it. I just didn't recognize it as complete. That realization scared me more than any public reaction had. Because names aren't just labels. They're commitments. To change one, or even question it, is to admit that the person you've been answering to might not be the one you're becoming. At home, the conversations with my mother deepened. Not about identity directly, but about ethics. About responsibility. About how much truth you owe others when you're still discovering it yourself. You're allowed to be private, she told me one night as we washed dishes. But secrecy is different. Secrecy corrodes trust, even when it's well-intentioned. I asked her how to tell the difference. She smiled faintly. Privacy protects process. Secrecy protects fear. That distinction became a compass. I started practicing honesty in smaller, safer ways. Correcting assumptions gently instead of laughing them off. Saying, I don't know yet, instead of pretending certainty. Allowing awkward silences to exist without rushing to fill them. Some people met that honesty with care. Others met it with irritation, as if my refusal to resolve myself quickly were an inconvenience. I learned that impatience often masquerades as concern. The hardest conversations weren't hostile. They were loving. My aunt called one evening, her voice tight with worry. She spoke in careful euphemisms, asking whether I was confused, whether my mother was encouraging things, whether I understood how the world can be. I listened. Then I said, calmly, I understand the risks. I'm choosing awareness anyway. There was a long silence on the line. I just want you safe, she said finally. So do I replied. And meant something slightly different than she did. That call left me shaken. Not because she was cruel, she wasn't, but because it revealed how often love is expressed as control when fear enters the room. I understood then how easy it would be to fold, to reassure others by shrinking myself back into familiarity. But shrinking had never made me safer. It had only made me quieter. As the weeks passed, I noticed another change, one I hadn't anticipated. I became more patient with other people's contradictions. Once you stop pretending to be internally consistent, you recognize how rare that consistency is in anyone else. I listened better. I judged less quickly. I understood that most resistance isn't about you, it's about the stories people are afraid to rewrite. One afternoon, walking home alone, it hit me with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about expression. It was about maturity. About stepping out of inherited scripts and accepting the weight of authorship. Choosing yourself isn't just freeing. It's demanding. It asks you to stand by your choices without turning them into weapons or shields. By the end of that period, I still didn't have answers that fit neatly into forms or conversations. I hadn't arrived at language that felt permanent. But I had learned something fundamental. Identity isn't something you claim once and defend forever. It's something you practice with care, humility, and accountability. And once you begin practicing, you don't get to pretend you didn't know better before. That knowledge didn't make me lighter. It made me steadier. There is a particular moment in long, difficult changes when nothing new happens, and yet everything settles. That was the final stretch for me. Not a climax, not a declaration, not a scene anyone would point to and say this is when it became clear. It was quieter than that. More demanding. It was the period where I had to live inside the consequences of the awareness I'd gained without relying on novelty to carry me forward. By then, people had adjusted, not completely, not uniformly, but enough that my presence no longer felt like an interruption everywhere I went. That adjustment brought relief, and with it, a new responsibility. When disruption fades, you lose the excuse of being new. What remains is character. I noticed how easy it would have been, at that point, to turn my experience into a posture. To become rigid where I had once been invisible. To confuse self-knowledge with moral superiority. That temptation surprised me, and I was grateful it did. It reminded me that identity work doesn't end when you're seen, it deepens. I became more deliberate about listening. Not the passive listening I'd practiced most of my life, where silence functioned as compliance, but an active attention that asked, what is this person actually trying to protect? What fear is speaking underneath their words? That shift changed my relationships more than any external expression ever had. Jonah and I talked more openly then, not about labels or outcomes, but about uncertainty. About the pressure to be legible in a world that prefers clean narratives. About how exhausting it is to feel like you're always becoming in a culture that rewards arrival. Our friendship didn't survive because he understood everything I was doing. It survived because neither of us demanded completion from the other. At school, the curiosity faded into something like familiarity. A few people grew braver in their questions. A few grew quieter. I learned to tell the difference between someone asking to understand and someone asking to confirm a belief they already held. I answered the first kind generously. I set boundaries with the second without apology. That balance, openness without self-erasure, took practice. At home, my relationship with my mother changed in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because she treated me differently, but because I did. I began to see her not just as a guide or protector, but as a person who had made difficult choices long before I was old enough to notice. I asked her about her own moments of misalignment. About what she had given up to remain legible. About what it had cost her to raise me without forcing certainty where she herself had learned to distrust it. She answered honestly. Not romantically. Not regretfully. Honestly. That honesty deepened my respect for her more than any act of support could have. It taught me that courage doesn't always look like change. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like waiting long enough for someone else to choose themselves. There were still hard days. Days when I felt exposed for no reason. Days when the effort of being intentional made me long for the numb efficiency of my old habits. Days when I wondered whether I'd mistaken awareness for progress. On those days, I reminded myself of something simple and difficult: growth isn't a straight line, and integrity isn't measured by comfort. What steadied me most was the realization that my life no longer felt theoretical. I wasn't rehearsing a version of myself for some future moment of authenticity. I was living inside the process, accepting its unevenness, allowing myself to be accountable without demanding perfection. I never arrived at a single word that solved everything. I never reached a point where all questions resolved into certainty. What I reached instead was alignment, not constant, not effortless, but real. A sense that my inner life and my outward actions were in conversation rather than conflict. That conversation continues. If there is any value in telling this story, it isn't to suggest that self-discovery is simple or universally rewarding. It's to offer something quieter and, I think, more useful, the understanding that paying attention to yourself is an ethical act. That choosing honesty over ease reshapes not just your own life, but how you move through other people's lives. That empathy deepens when you stop treating identity as a problem to solve and start treating it as a responsibility to carry with care. I didn't become someone else. I became accountable to the person I'd been avoiding. And that, more than anything, changed how I understand what it means to live well.